Well, top of the mornings, me lads and lasses. Now, whenever we hear the word fairy, normally things like this come to mind. Well, believe it or not, that doesn't come even remotely close to how fairies are actually depicted in folklore, particularly Celtic. In Celtic lore, there existed a great deal of respect and fear towards a group of supernatural entities known as the Fae, and they're divided into two factions. The Seelie Court, which comprises a more kind and benevolent Fae, and the Unseelie Court, which consists of more darker and cruel Fae. So in honor of St. Patrick's Day, I'm going to be focusing on showing you some of the more darker and malignant Fae that Celtic lore has to offer. And trust me when I say that you really do not want to encounter any of these things. But before we start though, please hit like and subscribe. That would mean very much to me. Also, I'm like 99% sure I'm going to be butchering up the pronunciations on some of these, so if I do, please forgive me. Anyway, with all that said, let's get to it. So we'll start off with one that I'm sure many of you may recognize, the Banshee, or spelled in the actual Gaelic spelling, Banshee. Now, if you know them, you'll know that they're basically omens of death. Banshees aren't openly hostile, but they don't really need to get physical when it comes to ushering in someone's death. Just hearing a banshee scream alone is enough to know that your death is closer than you probably wish it was. Not only that, but it's also some of the most horrific shit you'll ever hear. I've seen YouTube videos on how people imagine a banshee scream sounds like. I'll show you a few of them, but just keep in mind that these sounds are going to be pretty disturbing and possibly even pretty loud, so you might want to adjust your volume. So I'll leave you a timestamp here if you want to skip it. Yeah, definitely not the kind of sound you'll want to hear. Now, if you thought hearing the scream of one banshee is bad, it's even worse when a group of these things are heard, as this signifies the death of somebody of great importance. And their origins are kind of messed up too, as they're believed to be the spirits of women who died during childbirth or who were murdered. So when you really think about it, their ear-piercing scream kind of makes sense. Now, as far as their appearance goes, banshees often take on the form of beautiful young women, middle-aged matrons, or even rattled old hags. They're also said to be dressed in gray clothes and having long, unkempt hair. Regardless though, if you're unlucky enough to encounter a banshee, not even the best earplugs or noise-canceling headphones are gonna save your ass. Yeah, at that point, all you can really do is hope to God that you got everything off your bucket list checked off. Going from one harbinger of death to another, we have the Dullahan, and I'm sure many of you may recognize this one as well. The Dullahan takes on the form of a headless rider riding on top of a black steed, holding its severed head under one arm and using a human spine as a whip. Now, while the Banshee screams as a way to foretell someone's death, for the Dullahan, all it takes is to shout the name of someone who is doomed to die. And looking at the Dullahan is said to make you either go blind or having a bucket of blood thrown in your face. It is said that should you hear the sound of pounding hooves but catch no sign of any horse or rider, that's a sign that a Dullahan is nearby. And even worse, whenever the Dullahan stops, a mortal soon perishes. Luckily though, there is a way to defend yourself. All you simply need is just a golden object, as gold is said to ward off the Dullahan or even make it vanish. And if you think that this looks a lot like the Headless Horseman from the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, well, that's because Washington Irving, the story's author, actually used the Dullahan as inspiration. The more you know. Okay, I'd argue that this next one just might be one of the most morbid fae I've ever seen. Meet the Derek Dua, which literally translates to red bloodsucker. Yeah, with a name like that, you can already tell that shit is definitely going to hit the fan. In a sense, the Derek Dua is a lot like a vampire, as she feeds on the blood of the living. Well, more specifically, the blood of men. Though, she wasn't always like this. According to legend, Derek Dua was a beautiful young woman who was from a very wealthy family. She was beloved by everyone in the country, and ultimately she fell in love with a peasant. But of course her father, being the uptight asshole that he was not accepting of that. And instead, he marries her off to an older man who was much richer than him. Father of the year, am I right? And if you think that's already bad now, just wait, it's gonna get worse. And trust me, this is where things get really fucked up. The man her douchebag father married her off to was incredibly abusive, as he locked her in a tower where only he could see her. And if that already wasn't enough, he developed a sick habit of cutting her skin and watching the crimson blood flow from her wounds. Ultimately, the constant suffering proved too much for her to bear, so she decides to put an end to it all by taking her own life. But because of the injustices committed upon her, her spirit would not rest. So she rose from the grave and began attacking young men to drain their blood. Also, are you familiar with the phrase, "Hell hath no fury that a woman scorned"? Well, apparently her husband and Daddy Dearest weren't, as she basically drained every ounce of their blood until they dropped dead. So at least she finally got the justice she deserved. Hey, karma's a bitch. So next up is the Kelpie, and if you weren't afraid of horses already, then you certainly will be after encountering one of these things. Kelpies often take on the form of dark-colored horses with hides as smooth as a seal's and cold as death to the touch. Though sometimes they're also described as green in color with a fishtail that is often curled. Now, I'm sure some of you are probably thinking, what's the big deal? It's just a pretty horse. Well, you might want to think again, you dumbass. Because you go near a Kelpie and you're pretty much in for a watery grave. The reason why Kelpies take on the form of horses is because that's their way of tricking their victims. And Kelpies are particularly dangerous towards children. A Kelpie basically encourages people to ride on them, and anyone unfortunate enough to fall for this ruse will find themselves stuck to the Kelpie's skin and ultimately dragged into the watery depths, where the Kelpie will then proceed to devour them. So yeah, with that said, it's pretty obvious that Kelpies should be avoided at all costs. Alright, so next up we have the Faucon, a fae that looks goofy but is incredibly monstrous. Yeah, this thing is truly an oddity, as it hops around on a single leg, has a single arm in the center of its chest, a single wild eye in the center of its forehead, and is even covered in blue feathers. Yet despite the feather coat it has, it is incapable of flight unlike other fae. And they're said to be so horrendous to look at that even just a single glance can stop a grown man's heart. And that's not to mention the intense vanity issues it has. Seeing its image as a mockery of the gods, it violently takes its anger on anyone unfortunate enough to stray into its domain, which is high up in the highlands. And that is not to mention that this thing has a hatred for all life. And apparently, it can destroy entire farms and orchards in just a single day. I'm not really sure how it can do that with a single arm and leg, but whatever. Now combine all of that with the fact that it carries a poison-tipped spiked club, and you got a fae that you really don't want any beef with. So this next one is a bit of a two-for-one because they're both sort of connected. That being the Kushi, or fairy hound, and the Catshi, or fairy cat. So the Kushi is often described as a wolf about as large as a cow or a small calf with shaggy green fur and either a braided or curled tail. Meanwhile, the Catshi is described as a black cat about the size of a large dog with a white spot on its chest and is sometimes depicted as standing on 2 legs. Now, what is the connection between the two, you ask? Well, that's because both the Kushi and the Catshi steal human souls. However, their methods heavily differ. You see, very much like the Banshee or the Dullahan, the Kushi is very much a harbinger of death. A Kushi will signify its presence with 3 loud barks or howls, and anyone unfortunate enough to hear said barks or howls must find shelter quick, otherwise by the time the 3rd bark is heard, that poor soul is doomed to die through the sheer terror. And upon death, the Kushi will drag that person's soul to the afterlife. The Catshi, on the other hand, steals the souls from corpses that are awaiting burial. So in a sense, these two are much like the Batman and Robin of the fairy world, but instead of fighting crime, they are taking lives. Next up is a fae whose name literally speaks for itself, the Redcap. Also named Dunters or Poweries, Redcaps are by far some of the most violent and murderous of all the fae. They're described as goblin-like humanoids with wide mouths, razor-sharp teeth and claws, and of course, wearing a red hat. And speaking of the red-colored caps, there is a good reason for that. When I said Redcaps are some of the most violent and murderous of all the fae, I really mean that. These things are found in abandoned and ruined castles in the borders between England and Scotland, and any poor soul unfortunate enough to wander into their domain is immediately reduced to a bloody mess after being attacked by the Redcaps. And shortly afterward, the Redcaps will dip their hats into the spilled blood of their victims, thereby increasing their power in the process. Oh, and don't think you can easily outrun these little bastards because they are impossibly fast. Luckily though, these things are not without weaknesses. To ward them off, all you have to do is recite quotations from the Bible, as this will cause the Redcaps immense pain, causing them to flee. So if you got a Bible on you, it should come in handy when facing a Redcap, but probably not with our final entry. And of course, I've saved the best for last. This is the Knuckleavi. And yeah, this thing definitely looks like it came straight out of the depths of hell. Described as a man fused to the back of its horse, with arms that reach the ground, a wide bulbous head, and devoid of any skin whatsoever, leaving muscles and tendons fully exposed. A sight like that would scare... Yeah, a sight like that would scare the piss out of even the most hardened of men. And trust me, this thing is just as monstrous as it looks. Existing to bring suffering among the living, this barnyard abomination is known for breathing out a fetid smoke that can cause livestock to turn sick and die, crops to wilt, and leave children cold and dead in their cribs. Luckily, even something this terrifying is not without weaknesses. Since this thing is a sea monster, it has a strong aversion to fresh water. So all you have to do is simply cross a river or stream and you'll get this thing off your back. And hey, if it's raining, that's a huge bonus. Otherwise, you're practically screwed, my guy. Well, everything I showed you will definitely change the way you look at fairies from now on. Which one of these would you want to avoid at all costs? So I hope you liked what you saw. If you did, then please hit like and subscribe. And I wish you all a happy St. Patty's Day. So as they say in Ireland, Slán Agat.